dyma ni'n rhoi Glyndŵr yn ei le. A'i le fe I ddechrau yn hanesyddol. We're going to put Glyndŵr in his place. To start off with, in his historical context. I do love an historical context. A wy'n tymlo bod ni'n tueddu weithio I weld a I weld cyfnodau hanesyddol gyffredinol. Ar wahân, a fel sy'n nhw wedi cael ei ynysu o fewn yn ymwybyddiaeth ni. We tend, I think, to see historical figures and historical topics generally on their own, isolated, without their context. O'i'n meddwl yn bwysig iawn I gofio, siwt fyd oedd pan oedd Glyndŵr pan oedd e'n byw mewn gwirionedd, o ail hanner y trydydd ganrif, y bedwaredd ganrif ddeg, mlaen I 15th ganrif. We've got to remember what sort of world it was that Glyndŵr was living in at the end of the 14th century and the beginning of the 15th. So mae eisiau ni gofio mor debyg ac mor anhebyg oedd I fyd i'n byd ni. We have to remember how alike and how different Glyndŵr's world was from ours. Yn I ddechrau gyda'r newyn mawr. Newyn mawr oedd, wel, mob pwrpas, hanner cynta, y 4th ganrif. The Great Famine, which struck Europe, across all Europe, in the first half of the 14th century, around about 1300, oedd glaw ofnadw o stormydd, cynhaiafau yn methu a phobl yn farw o newyn. There was a terrible series of bad harvests, dreadful weather with storms and dreadful rainfall. And, you know, when the harvest failed, people starved to death. Dyw oer ni'n neud ffasol yn o bryd, falle bydd ddim digon o bwyd yn nadolig I ni. Ond oedd ddim digon o fwyd gyda pobl, ac yn o'n marw o ddiffyg bwyd. We're making enough of a fuss now about the problems, possibly, about not having mince pies or Christmas puddings. But actually, in this time, and for centuries afterwards, no food meant starvation for poor people, and they did starve to death. Yma yng Nghymru, here in Wales, people starved to death. Wedyn, wrth gwrs, rhywbeth sy'n fwy cyfarwydd I ni, na'r hanes y newyn yma ar ddechrau, hanner cynta y 4th ganrif ar ddeg, oedd y Plague D. More familiar to us as a devastating historical event was the Black Death, which killed probably between a third and a 40% of people, 30–40% of people across Europe between 1346 and 1350. Y Plague D wedi lledd traian falle 40% o bobl ar draws Ewrop gyfan. Dros rhyw, beth wedi'n ni, 4–5 mlynedd, 1346 ar draws Ewrop, 1340. Ac Gareth has gang ys i'n ffindo llun erchill o ble dawns marwolaeth, dawns angau. A mae e'n dangos erchyllderau marwolaeth yn y cyfnod yma. A'r mae'n teimlo bod marwolaeth yn gorchwygu bywyd. There was a time when people, this is the dance of death, which Gareth has very kindly found me somewhere, and it shows pretty graphically the horrors of the plague and the belief that people had that death was triumphing over life in this dreadful period in the middle of the 14th century. Ac yn fuan wedi hynny, of course, ganed Glyndŵr, and Glyndŵr, we believe, was born shortly after the end of the worst of the plague. Ond cofiwch chi, oedd y ple yn endemic yn y boblogaeth trwy Ewrop gyfan o hynny ymlaen. The plague was endemic throughout the populations of Europe from then on. Chi'n cael blynyddoedd pan mae'n dod ymlycach to, falle rhyw variant, fel ni'n siarad amdano fo nawr, rhyw amrywiolyn yn y ple oedd yn achosi fe, ond oedd y ple yn digwydd ar y degau. Ac oedd hi'n wath ar y degau, a wedyn oedd hi'n gyfnod tywel. The plague was endemic, it was, populations became inured to it, and then sometimes maybe the variant in the mutation in the gene, we just don't know. But whatever it was, there were episodes of plague from then on for centuries in Europe. Ac, of course, in ni'n byw, ni ddim yn dioddau o newyn dim ragor, ond ni yn dioddau yng nghyno ple ar hyn o bryd. And of course, although we no longer, at the moment, feel the effects of famine and shortage of food, nevertheless, we are living through another pandemic. Cynrwg ar ple D, as bad as the Black Death, ond mae gyda ni feddyginiaeth a mae gyda ni wyddoniaeth I aresgyn hynny. We fortunately have resource to medical science, which enables us to put up a valiant defense against the illness. And of course, we know its causes better than they did, poor souls, in the 15th century, in the 14th century. Fi ffili cyfri y math yn Saesneg a Gymraeg. I find it very difficult to count in both English and Welsh, felly mae rhaid I chi fadda I fi o'i'n ofni. Byddwch chi'n gweld y dyddiadau ar y sgrin, felly os o'i'n neud camgymeriad, byddwch chi'n deall beth sy'n digwydd. I will, if I do make mistakes, at least the dates will be up on the screen, so you have a fair idea what's going on. Now, dyma adeg pan oedd pobl yn grediniol. This is a time when people really did believe in their religion. Ac o'n nhw'n credu bod bywyd a marwolaeth yn agos iawn I gilydd, ac o'n nhw'n credu bod gan yr eglwys atebion iddi problemau nhw. Bydd yr seintiau yn gwrando ar y gweddiau, bydden nhw'n gallu mynd ar bererindodau, a bydden nhw'n gallu cael I ryddhau o'i clefydau nhw. This was a time when people were extremely religious. They believed that the saints would hear their prayers, that they would heal them from their illnesses. O chi gallu mynd ar bererindod I ffynonau iachau fel ffynon fair ym Mhenrhys yn y Rhondda, a o chi gallu gobeithio a gweddio am welliant. You could go on pilgrimages to holy wells, like ffynon fair, like Mary's Well in Penrhys in the Rhondda, and you could believe and you could hope for some return to health. Ond, yn y cyfnod yn y 15fed ganrif, yn y 40 ar 15fed ganrif, I chi'n cael y rhaniad mawr yn yr eglwys Gatholig, yr unig eglwys yn Ewrop ers cyfnod yr ymerodraeth Rhufain. Ers 500 mlynedd, un eglwys oedd, eglwys Gatholig. It was for 500 years, since the end of the Roman Empire, there had been, well, nearly 1,000 years, hang on, I'm getting this wrong, nearly 1,000 years, there had been one church. And that was the Catholic Church. It included everybody. That's what Catholic means. And it was the unity of Christendom, which was the sort of the foundation of people's world. The Welsh poetry talks about byd cred, the believing world. Mae Barddoniaeth Cymraeg yn siarad o bod I byd cred a Christnogaeth a bob Christian, fel wylygu pob person. Felly oedd yn Gatholig, oedd yn cynnwys pawb. Ac yna, yn y cyfnod mae'r eglwys yn rhannu. Sorry, I will skip on to that. Beth yw'r un awr? Sorry, wedi colli. Dyma'r eglwys a fi nôl i'r lleill. I went on a bit too far then, so I'm going to go back and pick up the other slides. Here we've got the divisions in the Catholic Church. Dyma chi raniadau yn eglwys Rhufain, gyda lluniau eto. Diolch Gareth. Eglwys Rhufain, mod yr urddas a chyfoeth yr eglwys, a'r pab yn cael ei symud I Avignon oherwydd gwrthryfel ac anflonlyddwch yn Rhufain. Ac mae'n amlwg bod yr raniadau hyn yn tanseilio y teimlad o bobl bod nhw mewn byd dealladwy. It's clear that from when the Pope was forced because of popular uprising and his enemies to move from Rome to the security of Avignon and the protection of the French king, that there were then two popes, and there was a sense of that Christianity, byd cred, Christendom, had been shaken to its foundations. There were cracks in the whole structure, which people felt were the foundations of their life and the parameters in which they lived. Felly mae rhaniadau hyn yn rhannu y byd I bobl yn y cyfnod yma. A wedyn, mae gyda ni wedyn, oherwydd pledi, oedd treian y boblogaeth wedi marw, oedd y rhai oedd yn weddill yn gallu gofyn am arian fel tef. Oedd ddim eisiau weithio am fynd am racor, ond gallu gofyn am gyflog. So you get, in results of the Black Death, you get the growth of the money economy. that people who had been working for free, they gave a labour rent, they were able to charge for their money and ask for be paid in money. Ac oedd rhaid I bobl dderbyn hynny, y tir feistri yr arglwyddi, the landlords and the gentry had to accept that their peasantry were no longer working for nothing. Ac oedd arian yn dod yn fwy cyffredin. The use of money was becoming much more common. I chi'n cael siopau yn datblygu fel mae'r llun gwych ma'n dangos. You get shops and markets developing quite rapidly, as this terrific picture shows. A doedd bobl ddim bellach yn byw yn hunan gynhaliol, oedd y newyn wedi gwneud yn anodd iawn iddyn nhw byw yn hunan gynhaliol, o'n nhw gallu nawr edrych ymhellach am gymorth a hynny trwy arian. They could look a bit further than home for their sustenance, and they could pay for it as well. So shops and markets develop, and fairs and trade develops, and the merchant class becomes extremely important, as I'm going to refer to later on. Felly mae datblygiad dosbarth masnachol yn gyflym iawn yn y cyfnod yma. Ac oedd yr hen draddodiad na'r hen driawd oedd wedi bod yn strwythuro bywyd ffiwdal. Y rhai oedd yn rheoli ac yn ymladd, y rhai oedd yn gweddio, y rhai oedd yn gweithio'r tir. Oedd hwnna yn cael ei danseilio gan ddatblygiad, economi arian, a chwyddiant oedd yn dilyn ar hynny, oherwydd oedd bobl yn gofyn am fwy o arian oherwydd prynder bobl a felly mlaen. Felly mae strwythur cymdeithas yn cael ei siglo gan y pledi a gan ddatblygiad yr economi arian. So people who had been accepting the traditional feudal divisions of society into the class who ruled and who fought and protected the people, and protected in inverted commas, that class of people, the people who prayed, who were the churchmen, who looked after the souls, and the people who labored the fields and produced the food that people ate. That was the traditional tripartite division of society, which is reflected in the division of the current Houses of Parliament in Westminster. The Lords are the Lords spiritual and temporal, the bishops and the lords, lay lords, and the commons, the common people. So you get that tripartite feudal division. But at this time, there was a sense that there was a new class coming in, the merchant class. The old structure of society was being shaken. Felly mae Glyndŵr yn datblygu yn tyfu lan mewn byd ansicr iawn iawn. Glyndŵr was born into and grew up in a very, very uncertain world in many, many ways. Ac roedd yn fyd o ryfel. Oedd yr system feudal wedi seilio I raddau pell iawn ar drefen filwrol. Ac oedd y brenin yn rheoli, wel, y brenin William wedi ennill Loegr trwy rym arfer, ac oedd e'n rheoli trwy rym arfer, ac oedd e'n, beth wedwn ni, yn rhoi pethau awdurdod, oedd e'n trosglwyddo pethau awdurdod i'w ddirprwyon ar arglwyddi, a'r marchogion, oedd disgwyl iddyn nhw ymladd mwyn cadw I tir nhw. A o'n nhw trwy ymladd yn amddiffyn pobl y bethau. Ac oedd y gymdeithas yma, gymdeithas filwrol yma, a'r delfryd milwrol, oedd hwnna yn dominyddu syniadau pobl a'i hagweddau nhw sygat fywyd yn gyffredinol. The feudal system was based on a military concept, idea that land was won and retained by force of arms. This was how King William had won England by battle, and it continued to be so for many hundreds of years. But it was being shaken at this time. Nevertheless, it was the 14th and 15th centuries were a time of war, dreadful wars. The 100 Years' War is just one example of the wars which tore Europe apart. It was a militaristic society. The Crusades were no longer being fought, so the soldiers were not going overseas to fight, they were fighting amongst themselves. And because the King of England claimed France as part of his kingdom, the 100 Years' War between France and England went on for a very long time, bit over 100 years. There were truces, but it's a time of war, and it's a time of uncertainty and fighting. And as I say, the militaristic sense of society was shaken, but nevertheless, it continued to be the raison d'etre of the upper classes and the structure we were used to in terms of the way they lived. Felly, dyma chi gymdeithas filwrol yn ei hanfod, chymdeithas oedd yn arfer y rhyfela, dyna pwrpas bywyd. Marchogion a'r glwyddi, o'n nhw'n cael eu fforddi ymladd ac ymladd oedd eu bywyd nhw. Ac o'n ysnegrwn ymladd tramor yn y Croesgadau, o'n nhw'n mynd wedyn i ymladd ymlaeth ei gilydd, neu ymhlith yn erbyn teyrnasoedd eraill. A chi'n gweld rhyfel can mlynedd, rhyfel rhwng Brenin Ffrainc a Brenin Lloegr, os y tir oedd Brenin Lloegr yn ei harddel yn Ffrainc. Ac mae hwnna'n ran o feddylfryd y cyfnod, y syniad yma o ymladd ac o ennill, cyfiawnhau eich bodolaeth chi, os chi yn gefnog ac yn tirfeirianwr, o chi'n cyfiawnhau eich bodolaeth chi wrth fod yn farchog wrth ymladd. You justify your existence to a certain extent if you're a landowner by your right to bear arms. And it was a time of war, to a very large extent because of that. Right, yn ni'n denied y pisio nesaf yma, gyda'r eglwys. Mlaen yn ni, felly, i edrych nawr ar derfysgoedd hefyd yn y cyfnod yma. We're going to look now at the amount of rebellions and of riots and revolutions to a certain extent at this time. The lovely image comes from the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, another image that Gareth had got for me. And but this was typical of the time. It was a time of uprisings, the peasantry and the new merchant classes, quite often, the new bourgeoisie, leading revolts against traditional feudal authority. And the motto of the Peasants' Revolt, as many of you will know, in 1381, was when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? And the idea was that this is almost a democratic assertion of the people's power. It is the Peasants' Revolt against the authority of the king. Felly, mae gyda chi nawr enghraifft yn agos I gytrym yn gwirionedd, gwrthryfel y gwirionwyr, y wirin bobl yn Lloegr 1381. A'i arwyddau'r nhw, chi wedi clywed fi'n dyfynnu fan Saesneg, felly oedd ddim yn ei ail adroddi, ond mae'n arwyddau'r ddemocratedd heriol yn dweud pwy sydd yn heiddi cael byw yn gyfforddus, pwy sy'n gwneud y gwaith, pwy yn gwneud y gwaith yn dechrau'r byd. Felly, rwch I ni yn hawliau ni. A fe ddath y bobl at y brenin I ofyn am gyfiawnder ac am trigaredd yn erbyn I arglwyddi nhw. A chi'n gwybod falle hanes trist hyn, mae Wat Tyler arweinydd yr gwrthryfel, mae'n cael ei berswado I fynd I siarad ar ei ben ei hunan gyda'r brenin ifanc Richard yr Ail. Mae un o arglwyddi Richard yr Ail, chi'n gweld hyn yn digwydd yn y llun, mae fe'n ymosod ar Tyler ac yn ei leddau. Mae'r brenin ifanc yn ôl yr hanes yn mynd at y dorf o'r rhyfelwyr ac yn gweud fi fydd eich arweinydd chi nawr o hyn ymlaen. A maen nhw'n derbyn hynny, pwy oer. The end of the Peasants' Revolt with its extremely challenging motto. You probably know the story that they came to London and they asked to speak to the king in person, and the very young king, Richard II, went forward to speak to them and was persuaded Wat Tyler, their leader, to come to talk to him in person, which Tyler did and got struck down and killed for his trusting the king. However, the king then apparently persuaded the peasantry that he would be their leader and they could trust him. Don't know what grounds they have for saying that, but there we go. That's the story. Ond dyna un enghraifft o wrthryfel. Oedd na wrthryfeloedd, oedd na 80 o ryfeloedd wrthryfeloedd yn yr Almaen yn unig, rhwng 1336 ac 1535. A oedd na ryfeloedd tebyg yn y 4th ganrif ar 10 a'r 15fed, yn Galicia, yn Sbaen, yn Transylvania, yn Sweden, ledled Ewrop, i chi'n cael aflonyddwch, i chi'n cael wirin bobl yn herio awdurdod ac yn gofyn am gyfiawnder. Fel rheol, o'n nhw'n mynd at ei brenin i ofyn iddo fe, fel ffynhonnell gyfiawnder yn ei syniadau nhw, i fod yn deg o'i tegwch iddyn nhw. A fel rheol, o'n nhw'n cael ei siomi. So this is a time of revolt and rebellion, 60 rebellions across Germany between 1536 and, hang on, let me just check that then, 1336 and 1525. And there were rebellions also across Europe, so as far apart as Sweden, Galicia, and Transylvania, where the peasantry and the new bourgeoisie went to appeal quite often to the ruler, to the king, for justice and mercy, because he was perceived, according to their lights, as the font of justice and mercy. Usually they were disappointed in their requests, but this was their belief, almost a childlike belief in the king as the father of his people. Oedd e bron fel plentyn yn gael wedi dead, ac yn bod chi'n cofio wrth gwrs a Rwsia, tad bach i bobl. Yr un agwedd bod y brenin yn fel riant iddi y ddeiliad iddi bobl e. So you get this rather innocent image of the king as the father of his people. The Tsar of Russia is the little father of his people, or rather was the little father of his people. Don't think Putin has quite succeeded him in that respect. Felly, dyma chi y terfysgoedd a'r gwrthryfeloedd ac un enghraifft enwog ohonyn nhw. Ond, mae gyda chi hefyd datblygiad arall, sef cynnal seneddau i geisio rhoi cyfle i bobl drafod i problemau ac i cael atebion iddyn nhw gan y brenin. You now, in this period, get the development of parliaments, a development that starts at different times and, quite early on in some cases. But the idea is that you get people together to discuss their problems and to find solutions to them, ideally. Mae hanes y syneddau yn ddiddorol iawn oherwydd mae y Synedd San Steffan yn licio disgrifio hunan fel mam syneddau'r byd, sydd ddim yn wir o gwbl. Mae Senedd Gwlad yr Iâ, the All-Thing, wedi bod yn mynd ers 930 oed Crist, sef dros 1000 o flynyddoedd. Ond yr All-Thing yw cyfarfod pawb, fe mae'r enw'n awgrymu. Oedd na Senedd wedi bod yn Sbaen, yn Leon yn Sbaen, oedd yn deyrnas ar wahân yn 11, ers 1188. Ac oedd hwnna yn y drefn sydd yn arferol i seneddau ledled Ewrop, sef y brenin a'r arglwyddi, ac arglwyddi'r eglwys a'r wirin bobl, a'r rhaniad ffiwdal na o hyd. Ac oedd sawl senedd ledled Ewrop yn ôl y patrwn na. Yn reiddiol, dyma'r fersiwn fawr o'r seneddau bydd y brenin yn ei alw, gyfarfodydd i arglwyddi a'i gynghorwyr bydd nhw'n cael ei galw adeg rhyfel mwyn codi arian trwy tris i'r bobl, neu amser oedd y arglwydd neu brenin yn cael ei irddo'n farchog, neu oedd ei ferch yn briodi, oedd e'n gofyn am racor arian, ac nhw'n dadle bos, nhw'n rhoi'r arian. Felly, oedd yna draddodiad hir i seneddau ledled Ewrop, ond ar wahân i wled yr ie, seneddau yn dilyn y traddodiad feudal o nhw. So you get the development of parliaments across Europe from the 12th century onward, 1188 in Leon in Spain, a separate kingdom at the time. That is probably the earliest parliament in Europe. But they were all on the feudal pattern, the division of the king and his lords, the spiritual, the bishops, and the the common people, who would include a merchant class as time went on. But the idea, they originated from the royal councils and the councils which feudal lords called as well, to raise money for war, and also on special occasions like the knighting of the eldest son and the marriage of the eldest daughter. So these feudal gatherings became senates, became parliaments, especially as inflation got a grip on Europe and money needed to be raised because the traditional land rents were not bringing in enough money. Oedd chwyddiant a datblygu'r economi arian wedi rhoi hwb arall I ddatblygiadau seneddau Ewrop. Oherwydd oedd pobl nawr oedd wedi bod yn dibynnu ar renti I tiroedd nhw bellach yn gorfod ffindo ffordd arall o ger arian, a dyna pam galwodd de Montfort I seneddau pan yn 1258 mwyn codi arian, mwyn mynd i'r ryfel, ond codi arian oddi wrth marchnadwyr, felly fe alwodd bobl gyffredin mewn I senedd yn Lloegr am y tro cyntaf mewn gwirionedd. Felly, I ni yn edrych fan hyn ar rai o seneddau Glyndŵr, I ni'n edrych ar air llefydd os Glyndŵr I fod I ennill cynnal I seneddau fe. We know that Glyndŵr called parliaments. And we have, of course, in these slides, some examples of the places where he called his parliaments to meet what traditionally believed he called his parliaments, because in Machynlleth, the building isn't exactly of that age, and we've got DrElinJones' brilliant painting then of the Senedd in Pennal, which is much better known to us. Felly, mae'r seneddau yma yn datblygu yn y cyfnod yma, a mae Glyndŵr yn ddyn o'i oes, a rheolwr o'i oes, I alw senedd. Beth sy'n ddiddorol about I seneddau Glyndŵr I fi yw bod fe'n defnyddio falle dull hynach na feudaliaeth. It's possible that when Glyndŵr called his senates, his parliament, he was harking back to a pre-feudal convention, because we know that Howard Dda called representatives from the commotes when he wished to put together a collection of laws, or he wished to be a lawmaker, and that's part of the function of a Senate, of a parliament. And the all thing in Iceland, pre-feudal, 930 AD, that also calls on a democratic, if you like, representation of the people. And that is where Glyndŵr is quite forward-thinking, I believe, in his approach to how he has people to attend his parliaments. O'n credu bod Glyndŵr yn mynd nôl at drefen gyn-feudal, megis Howard Dda, yn galw cynrychiolwyr o bob cwmwd yng Nghymru at o fe mwyn iddo fe gasglu deddfa ac I ddeddfu. Un o brif swyddi Senedd yw I ddeddfu. Ac fel mae'r All Thing yn 930 yn defnyddio cynrychiolwyr o bob cymuned, oedd Glyndŵr yn galw am gynrychiolwyr o bob cymuned. Oedd ddim yn mynd am y rhaniad feudal yna, I ni'n gweld yn syniadau eraill I gyfnod. So Glyndŵr quite possibly harks back to a pre-feudal time, and is certainly more democratic in calling representatives very common. He may be forward thinking, maybe backward looking, ond mae llawer fwy cyffredin rhwng Senedd Glyndŵr a Senedd ni, na sydd rhwng Senedd Glyndŵr a Senedd Lloegr. But whether Glyndŵr was backward looking or forward thinking, his parliaments, in their composition, were much more similar to our Senedd today than our Senedd today is similar to the Parliament in Westminster. But I'm happy to discuss that in more detail later on. Beth bynnag, bwrw ni mlaen, let us crack on. Celti'r cipr amser na. Ond ar wahân i'r ffaith bod lle arbennig I Glyndŵr yn hanes ddatblygiad y Senedd, mae lle I Glyndŵr yn datblygiad hanes Cymru fel cenedl. Quite apart from Glyndŵr's place not only in the historical context, but in the history of the development of parliamentary representation, I would argue that Glyndŵr also has a place in the development of Wales's idea of itself. Oedd gan Glyndŵr, fel i chi gyd yn gwybod, o'n gwybod hynny, mae gan Glyndŵr I weledigaethau. A mae hynny yn cael ei gyflwyno, wrth gwrs, yn llythyr pennol. A yn llythyr pennol, mae fe'n sôn am yr angen I gael prifysgol prifysgolion yng Nghymru, un yn gogledd, un yn y de. A mae e moyn, wrth gwrs, I gael offeriadaeth oedd yn siarad Cymraeg. Offeriadaeth ac esgobaeth oedd yn rhan o'r bobl ac yn deall y bobl. Fel eich chi'n gwybod, oedd yr arfer ers o'r ysgyniad Normanaidd ac yn sicr ers 282 I benodi pobl oedd yn addas yn marn Brynyn Lloegr I arglwyddiaethu yn yr eglwys yng Nghymru, doedd e ddim yn dilyn bod nhw'n dderbyniol i'r Cymru I hunan. Ac wrth gwrs bod nhw ddim yn, wel, nhw ddim yn aml yn byw yng Nghymru I hunan. So mae fe moyn eglwys, fel ni'n gweud, un o'r sylfaeni bywyd pobl ar y pryd. Mae moyn I hynny fod yn Gymraeg ac yn Gymraeg. Mae moyn I brifysgol addysg i'r bobl, a mae moyn senedd, byddwn ni'n gweud, democrataidd. So we know that Glyndŵr had a vision. He wanted a Welsh-speaking church. He wanted the leaders of the church to be Welsh-speaking. Now, as I've said, the church was central, and it was the foundation of people's lives. In an uncertain world, they turned to the church. And he wanted that church to understand, be part of the nation of Wales. He wanted it to have a Welsh-speaking bishops, and he wanted a Welsh-speaking priesthood. And that is crucial to an awareness of identity in the 15th century. But it reflects his sense that it had to come from Wales and be of Wales, this central institution. For too long, well, certainly since the Norman conquest in 1066, and definitely since 1282, the tendency had been to appoint bishops in Wales, and they would appoint priests who were acceptable to the king and to the Norman lords, who were ruling more and more of Wales. And these people didn't of necessity speak Welsh, although it's highly unlikely that any of their parishioners speak much Norman French or English, that varied from Wales place to place, of course. But often they didn't even live in their diocese, and they had very little interest in them. Some of them, not all of them, some of them had little interest in them except as a source of income. And Glyndŵr also wanted universities. He wanted a university in the north of Wales, a university in the south of Wales, and he wanted those to be the institutions which produced the learned class and produced a priesthood, because that was what universities tended to do in those times. They were for the training of the clergy. But his ideas are put forward, of course, in Llythyr Pennol, the letter of Pennol, to the King of France. The enemy of the King of England in the 100 Years' War, my enemy's enemy is my friend. But he is putting forward a vision, a constructive way to bring Wales into line with the rest of Europe as an independent nation. We're talking about a man from the 15th century who was born and raised in the 14th century. We're not talking about a modern person in armor. We're talking about somebody in a bitter and divided and dangerous time, trying to work out a constructive way forward. Mae rhaid ni gofio, wrth gwrs, ni ddim yn siarad about Glyndŵr, ddylwn ni ddim yn siarad about Glyndŵr, fel dyn yn hoes ni, jyst yn digwydd gwisgo siwt o arfer. Mae e'n ddyn o'i oes ei hunan, wedi cael ei facu yn y 40 ganrif ar 10, cyfnod ansicr o pledi ar Newyn Mawr. Mae e wedi cael ei drwytho fel milwr, mae e wedi cael ei hyfforddi yn y byd ffiwdal, ond eto gyd, mae e'n trio ffindo ffordd ymlaen, ffordd adeiladol ymlaen, mewn byd ansicr, mewn byd o derfysg ac o drais, a mae'n trio adeiladu, siagata dyfodol. Mae'n adeiladu gyda seneddau, mod sy'n galw am gynrychiolwyr o bob cwmwd. Mae'n gwneud hynny trwy feddwl am addysg i'r bobl. Mae'n meddwl am hynny trwy roi prif sefydlu'r iaith mewn cyswllt Cymreg i iaith ac ei reiddio hi yng Nghymru hunan. So Glyndŵr is finding a way forward in this bitter time through universities to provide learning, through parliaments to provide representation for people from all parts of Wales, even small communities like Commots, and the major institution of life to be rooted in Wales, Welsh's language and Welsh, its institutions and customs. Dwi'n meddwl bod hwnna'n gweud rhywbeth am allu'r dyn I feddwl ymlaen. I still think that says something about his ability to think on and to think constructively and progressively as well. Felly dyna chi le Glyndŵr, yn ei gyd-destun hanes, yn ei gyd-destun cyfansoddiadol, a ni'n mynd edrych nawr arno fe mewn cyd-destun arall, cyd-destun hollol wahanol. We've looked at him now in his historical context and his constitutional context. And now I'd like to look at him in a very different context, which is the context of mythology. Oherwydd Glyndŵr oedd y meb darogan I lawer yn de, dyma'r un arweinydd oedd mynd I arwain I bobl at ryddid yn de. A yr un oedd wedi cael ei aso, yr un oedd wedi cael ei ddarogan, wedi cael ei broffwydo. Ac oedd yr syniadau yma am ei rymoedd a'r uwch naturiol, o'n wedi tyfu wrth gwrs mewn chwedloniaeth, a mae'r ffaith bod neb yn gwybod lle mae Glyndŵr wedi gladdu, ond mae Llyfr Athro Aled Williams yn gwybod yn well na neb, bod neb yn gwybod lle wedi gladdu, yn coef wrth gwrs yn yr un categori ac Arthur, anoeth byd bedd, byd bedd Arthur, bedd Arthur anadnabyddus ddydd brawd gyda barn. Felly, mae'n rhoi fe yng nghwmni arwyr oesoedd eraill. A mae fe yn ychwanegu at hynny, mae y stori a'r chwedlau amdano fe, a mi galluoedd uwch naturiol yn rhoi fe mewn byd chwedloniaeth. Ac mae llyfr ragorol Elisa Henkin ar Owain Glyndŵr yn olren yr ffordd oedd y ffigwr hanesyddol yma, dyn hollol hanesyddol, dyn I gyfnod, yn datblygu yn arwr chwedlonol, arwr chwedloniaeth boblogaidd. A fe gewch chi trosolwg ar hynny yn llyfr Athro Rhys Davies ar The Revolt of Owain Glyndŵr, I benod olaf fe yn olren datblygiad myth a chwedl Owain Glyndŵr. This entirely historical person, partly because of the legends or the stories accounted about his supernatural abilities. I can't call space in the vasty deep and mae'n meddwl fe yn rama Shakespeare, mae wedi datblygu yn y syniad mor gynnar â hynny. Ac mae fe mae'r syniadau yma a'r storïau amdano fe yr arwr poblogaidd yn datblygu yn arwr chwedlonol. The popular hero develops into a mythological hero. All these are reinforced by the fact that nobody knows where he's buried, which immediately puts him into the same category as King Arthur, who also, whose grave is unknown. And the idea that this lost leader, Mab Darogan, the prophesied leader who will bring his people to freedom, that he will arise again and lead them to freedom again. And that becomes part of a belief system after Glyndŵr's day. I mean, it was Cadwaladr, it was Arthur. There is always going to be somebody to lead his people to freedom. And Glyndŵr maybe is the last of those mythological leaders who takes root in popular consciousness. There's an excellent discussion of this in Elisa Henkin's book about Owain Glyndŵr, and a very good overview of it in the last chapter of Professor Rhys Davies's book on the revolt of Owain Glyndŵr, which trace the way in which that develops. But its power over popular imagination for centuries to come cannot be denied. He has his place in people's myths about themselves, in people's belief systems. And in Owen Roscommon talks about the grave Owen Glyndŵr, he is safe in the hearts of his people. Owen Roscommon yn siarad about beth Owen Glyndŵr yn ddiogel yng nghalonnau bobl. This is what happens. He has his place in mythology, in popular stories, in myths that we choose to make up about ourselves and about our history. Felly mae gan Glyndŵr I le mewn chwedloniaeth Cymru hefyd, ac am y stori amdano fe a fel mwyn i datblygu yn helpu ni I ffurfio syniadau am ein hunain fel pobl. Felly mae gan Glyndŵr I le mewn chwedloniaeth. A chi'n gweld hynny mor glir iawn y ddechrau'r 20th ganrif. And you can see this very clearly as, in the beginning of the 20th century. There he is. Dyna fe. Neuadd Farmor Caerdydd in the Marble Hall in Cardiff, amongst the other heroes who were perceived as heroes in the first decade of the 20th century. 100 years ago, people like General Picton were heroes. But so is Glyndŵr. He's there. And he's still there. Because, we can talk about the various opinion polls that were held, about the turn of the century, really, to choose the greatest people of all time. Gutenberg, Shakespeare, Caxton. I think this is a very English-based selection, isn't it? And Glyndŵr is there. He's in at 7, but he's in there with Leonardo da Vinci, and he beats Abraham Lincoln, Isaac Newton, and indeed Galileo. It's a very, very interesting poll. I think that was one run by the BBC. Gareth produced these figures. I had some other figures out of a BBC Wales poll done in, I think, 2004, where Glyndŵr came in second after Nyren Bevan, but after Neil Kinnock urged people to vote for Bevan to stop the nationalists putting Glyndŵr at the top. I'm sure you're all familiar with that story. But I think this is a very interesting poll, opinion poll, because of the wide-ranging nature of the names chosen, and there's a less political bias than you get in the Welsh poll. Felly, o'n i'n siŵr iawn o le des y ffigur yr canlyniadau hyn, ond o'n gwybod bod nhw'n rhoi lle anrhydeddus I Glyndŵr, oherwydd, mae Shakespeare a Caxton yn ei giro fe, mae hwn yn edrych I fi fel Paul eitha Saesnigedd I naws, ond mae fe yna. Mae fe'n curo Isaac Newton a Lincoln a Galileo. A dwi'n gwybod na beth ni'n mor uchel a hynny. Mae rhaid I fi gyfad, ac eto dyna lle mae fe. Mae fe'n seff, fel Owen Roscommon, mae'n seff yng nghalonnau bobl. A nid just pobl Cymru. Ymddengys felly, beth bynnag. Mae gan Glyndŵr I le yn hanes yn gyffredinol ac yn sicr mewn hanes poblogaidd. I think Glyndŵr, these opinion polls and the statues and the images of Glyndŵr, my great-grandfather won a chair at the Corwin Eisteddfod in 1860 for his awdl to, guess whom? Owen Glyndŵr. He's there, very much represented in popular mythology and in popular history as well. Oedd yn hyn y Ciwiwig, Twynog wedi ennill gader yn y Steddfod Corwen yn 1860 am I awdl ar Owen Glyndŵr. Mae'r ffaith bod e'n dal yna yn ymwybyddiaeth ni fel cenedl o Gymru, yn llenyddiaeth ni, yn chwedlau ni, yn hanes poblogaidd ni, hanes y wyren. Mae Glyndŵr yn seff yn hanes y wyren. A chi'n gweld hynny hyd heddi, ynddo? Glyndŵr's safe place in popular history is reflected in the use of his standard, increasingly used as one of the symbols of Wales. Dyna lle mae fe yn cwhwfan uwch pennau y bobl sy'n dod I Seneddau Machynlleth. It's there above the Senate House in Machynlleth. mae fyna, y ffordd i Gilmeri, pan ni'n cofio y Llywelyn Lliw Olaf. It's there, wet, miserable road up to Kilmary when we remember the death of Llywelyn Lliw Olaf. And fascinatingly enough, it's there in the castle, Cardiff Castle, I believe, the symbol of Norman strength and of the English domination of Wales. And there's Glyndŵr's flag saying, hang on, excuse me, i ni yma o hyd. O'i'n meddwl bod defnyddio limanau fel un o'r arwyddion Cymru yn ddiweddar mae hwn wedi digwydd dros hanner canrif diwethaf. Fel banner Dewi Sant i gynrychioli Cymru. Mae hwn yn rhywbeth gwahanol ddiweddar, ond eto, mae fe'n adlewyrchu y lle sydd gyda Glyndŵr yng nghalonnau bobl yn hanes poblogaidd ni ac yn y ffordd yn ni'n meddwl am yn hunain. Mae arwydder Glyndŵr nawr i weld i'ch ben i syneddu, ar y ffordd i Gilmeri, ond hefyd ar yn cestyll ni. Yr cestyll na sydd yn atgoffa ni bob dydd ni'n gweld nhw am oruchafiaeth, y Normaniad ac yn yr Saeson drosto ni. Ac eto, mae'r ysbryd na i ni yma o hyd. Ac o'i mae'n troi nawr at gymhariaeth falle anusgol i chi. O'i'n gobeithio bod i'n dangos i chi mor ganolog mae Glyndŵr mewn sawl agwedd o'n bywydau ni ac o'n gorffennol ni. I hope I've shown you how central Owain Glyndŵr is. His place is right in the middle of history of Europe, our constitutional history, and popular mythology and popular history. It's right there, it's central. I'm going to turn now to a rather more, possibly an unexpected comparison. I'm going to turn now to somebody you may probably, I don't know, some of you may have heard of him. A guy called Skanderbeg, Alexander Bey. Dyma arwr cenedlaethol Albania. I lunau yna fel hen ŵr, ond cerfyn ohono fe yn y sgwar ganolog yn Tirana, yn ei ddangos fel milwr, ac fel milwr oedd wedi cael ei hyfforddi gan ymerodraeth Ottoman, un o'i filwyr nhw. Ond dyn o Gwsiau yn Albania oedd a fe wedwch chi i gastell na chi ar y sgrin hefyd, ac yno oedd ei ddeulu fe'n byw, Giorgio Castriotti oedd ei enw fe pan oedd yn byw yn Albania yn blentyn. Fe gas ei hyfforddi gan yr Ottoman, a fe ddath yn un o'i gadfridogion nhw. A fe enillodd yr enw Arglwydd Alexander, felly ganddyn nhw. Ond, oedd e'n Gristion, fel llawer o filwyr yr Ottoman, ac o'n nhw'n Fwslimiad. A pan ddaeth yn ôl i Albania, fe ddechreuodd gwrdd wrth ryfel yn erbyn yr Ottoman. A hynny ar ddechrau'r 15fed ganrif. Oedd wedi cael ei eni yn 1455, bu ei farw yn 1453. Oedd wedi arwain gwrthryfel llwyddiannus iawn yn erbyn yr Ottoman. Skanderbeg, Giorgio Castriotti, when he was growing up in Albania, in Curzie, which is the castle you can see there on the screen, he was trained as a soldier by the Ottomans and fought successfully in their wars and became a general. He became the Lord Alexander to them. But he returned to Albania and he raised a revolt against Ottoman Muslim domination of Albania. And it was a successful revolt. It was fought against him in the first half of the 15th century. So he's roughly Glyndŵr's contemporary. And his place in the history and the mythology of Albania is not so much central as overwhelming. I was there a couple of years ago and I was just knocked out by this guy, Glyndŵr's contemporary, who was just absolutely everywhere in Albania. His coat of arms, the double-headed eagle, is their coat of arms. His colours, black and red, are their colours, national colours. It's incredible. We, in this country, tend to think of Albania in terms of Enver Hoxha and unbelievably strict communist rule, and also, of course, the believed popularity of Norman wisdom in Albania. Now, I can tell you, I didn't see a statue of Norman wisdom. I saw Skanderbeg absolutely everywhere. Statues, images, coins, everywhere. and legends about him and books about him. It's incredible. Now, in Cruje, his fortress and his home, there is this amazing museum, right? The picture of one of the rooms in it is there at the bottom of the screen. It's the only museum I've been in where there's actually no genuine artifact, as far as I could see, at all, apart from some of the walls of the castle. Totally rebuilt in the communist era to celebrate Skanderbeg as the national hero. There are murals absolutely everywhere about his life, his battles, legends about him, blah, blah, blah. The picture shows one of those rooms with its murals. It also shows a display of replica objects to do with Skanderbeg, his helmet and two of his swords. When he died, there are 4 items which are fairly clearly provenance as being in his possession at the time of his death. One is his helmet, and you can see an image of that on the screen, and the other are his 2 swords and his prayer book. None of them are in Albania. The helmet is in a museum in Vienna, and I think the 2 of his swords are. The prayer book is in private ownership. So, dyma chi Skanderbeg, arwr Albania, a dyma chi I gastell e sydd wedi troi yn amgueddfa o ryw fath cof amdano fe. Mae'r lle wedi cael ei ailgodi yn y cyfnod comunyddol, mae wedi cael ei droi yn amgueddfa, unig amgueddfa yw'n ddi eriod, so dim un wrthrych go iawn yn ddi. Mae popeth yn gopïau. A lluniau sy'n dehongli I fywydau trwy luniau, trwy fapiau, trwy fodelau a trwy chopïau o wrthrychau. Mae'r llun yn dangos I chi un ystafell, welydd yn dangos pob mes o pethau chwedlonol. Mae'r gwrthrychau sy'n cael ei dangos mor urddasol fyna, gopïau un nhw, I helmedau sy'n mewn amgueddfa yn Vienna, ac un a'i glyddo fe. Oedd 4 gwrthrych gyda fel pan fi farw, a ni gallu bod yn sef bod nhw'n perthyn I ddwyn yn ystod I fywydau. Un yw'r helmet, chi'n gweld fyna ar y sgrin, hwnnw nawr yn amgueddfa yn Vienna, lle mae gyda fe hefyd o'n credu. A y llall, 4 peth o trefygwyddiau, ac mae hwnna nawr mewn eiddo personol rhywun. Ond does dim un ohonyn nhw yn Albania hunan, ac eto, dyma fe ym mhobman. A dyw gweddill hanes Albania ddim yn cael ei... Mae'n anodd iawn dod o hyd I weddill hanes Albania. Mae Skanderbeg I arwr mawr nhw yn dominyddu I syniad nhw ohonyn nhw I hunan. Maen nhw wedi cymryd I baich arfer fe fel baich arfer wled, I liwiau fe fel lliwiau cenedlaethol Albania. Mae Skanderbeg yn bopeth. Ac I ni, wrth gwrs, ym Mhrydain, dyw Skanderbeg golygu rhyw lawer, falle chi'n gwybod amdano fo gwbl. I bobl Albania, mae fe'n hynod o bwysig, ac I bobl de-ddwyrain Ewrop, mae e'n bwysig. Oherwydd, oedd e'n wrthryfelwr yn erbyn I arglwyddau, fel oedd Gwrthlyndwr wedi ymladd yn erbyn Brenin Lloegr, ond oedd e'n Gristion yn ymladd yn erbyn Moslemiad. A mae hwnna yn newid y pwyslais. I gwledydd fel Awstria a Serbia a Croatia, dyma chi un o arwyr yr amddiffyn Cristnogaeth yn erbyn Islam. A'r adeg pan oedd Islam ar gynnydd ac yn ymosod ar ddwyrain Ewrop. Jan Sobieski, Brenin Gwlad Pwyl, yw un arall yn yr 15, ond Skanderbeg yw arwr mawr yr 15th ganrif, amddiffynwr Cristnogaeth yn erbyn Islam. So, Skanderbeg is everything in Albania. He is not very well known in this country, but he is very well known in Southeastern Europe, because in the time when the Byzantium, Constantinople fell in 1453, and from then on, Southeast Europe was under threat from the Ottoman Empire, from Islam. And Skanderbeg was one of the great defenders of Christianity against that threat. One of the other great defenders is Jan Sobieski, the King of Poland, who in the 17th century defended Vienna. But you have that same importance given to him as being one of the defenders of Christendom against the threat from the East, which, remember, he was a rebel. He, like Glyndŵr, rebelled against his feudal lord, but his feudal lord was an Islamic one, not a Christian. And Skanderbeg, with a lot of Venetian money behind him, actually, was successful. Glyndŵr failed. But he symbolizes Albania to the Albanians more than any other aspect of their history. He is absolutely overwhelming in Albania. And it's very, very difficult to come across any other aspects of Albanian history, bar Skanderbeg, and quite a lot about Hodja. So there is an example of somebody who is roughly Glyndŵr's contemporary, who is very differently remembered in his country, in his little country, from ours, where we remember Glyndŵr. So, ble ma Glyndŵr gyda ni heddi yn yn ysgolion ni? My last question really is, so where's Glyndŵr in our schools today? Ar ateb yw, I ni ddim yn gwybod. We don't really know how Glyndŵr is taught in schools today, whether he is, an automatic part of the curriculum. My belief is not, but I just don't know. There is no definite evidence. Dyn ni ddim yn gwybod, os dim tystiolaeth gadarn gyda ni, o le Glyndŵr yn y curriculum heddi. I ni ddim yn gwybod beth sy'n cael ei ddysgu o ran hanes mewn ysgolion Cymru. Ni ddim yn gwybod ers 10 mlynedd ar ugain beth yn union sy'n cael ei ddysgu. We don't really know. There's no certain evidence for about 30 years now of what's being taught in schools in Wales and history. Llawer iawn o syniadau gyda ni. Mae'r Cymdeithas, fel y gwyddoch chi, wedi bod yn dadlau dros yr angen I roi Glyndŵr yn y curriculum. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence that there isn't much taught about Glyndŵr, but we know the valiant campaign that the Society has led to ensure that he is properly acknowledged in our curriculum. So there's a big question mark over the place of Glyndŵr in schools in Wales. Safe in our hearts, possibly. Safe in our popular history. Pwy mor ddiogel yn ysgolion ni? Dyn ni ddim yn gwybod. Ond, yn y llyfr I, now, dyna lle wy'n dechrau nawr yr hysbysebu digwilydd. This is where I begin the totally shameless plugging of my book. Mae I Glyndŵr I le yn y llyfr yma. Mae just yn checo ar y clawr nawr. I cofe, he is standing sort of, you can see Bishop William Morgan in the front, and you can see Betty Campbell on his left, and Glyndŵr is actually on Betty Campbell's left as well. Felly chi'n gweld yr Esgob William Morgan yn y ceno, ar y clawr, I chi'n gweld Betty Campbell, y thrawes ddi gynta, prif athrawes ddi gynta yng Nghymru, a chi'n gweld Glyndŵr ar ei chwith hi. Felly mae fe yna yn y llyfr I. Ac mae fe hefyd yng nghanol y llyfr. Dyma chi'r tudalennau perthnasol am Glyndŵr yn y llyfr. Beth I nhw 89, 90, 91. Ti yn y ffordd trwy'r llyfr. So he's there in my book, on his cover, and of course in the middle of the book. And he is, I would say, central to the story of Wales. Mae fe'n ganolog I hanes Cymru. Ond nid fe yw hanes Cymru. He's not Skanderbeg. Nid fe yw Skanderbeg. Dyw e ddim, dyna, mae fe'n fwy, mae hanes Cymru yn fwy na Glyndŵr. Ond mae Glyndŵr yn greiddiol iddo fe. I hope I've shown you that Glyndŵr is central to the history of Wales. He belongs in the history of Wales. But he is not the history of Wales. We have more than Glyndŵr. But we have to have Glyndŵr in the middle in order to make sense of the rest of it. Mae rhaid bod Glyndŵr na ceno mwyn wneud synwyr o weddill hanes Cymru. A mwy na hynny, mwyn i ni edrych mlaen yn adeiladol ac yn bositif, fel nes yn ei gyfnod ranedig, peryglus, llawn ofnau a dychryn. Edrychodd mlaen fe adeiladodd at y dyfodol. So we, in a difficult and disjointed and dangerous time, just like Glyndwr's, need to have a vision, a constructive vision to go forward. And that is what I think Glyndwr gives us for his time. It's up to us to find a similar vision for our own. Dyna wy'n teimlo yn cyfrifoldeb ni yw i fagu ysbryd Glyndwr yn calona yn meddyliau ac edrych mlaen yn adeiladol ac yn bositif ac yn Gymraeg ac yn Gymreg sydd at yn dyfodol ni. Let us find a good, positive Welsh way forward. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi yn gwrando arno fi.